The smoke was still rising when Elvira Rourke rode in. She pulled her bay mare to a hard stop at the edge of what had been Elias Hawkins's hay barn, and the smell hit her before the sight fully registered, that thick, suffocating stench of burned feed, charred wood, and something deeper beneath it all. Something that smelled unmistakably like deliberate ruin. The barn skeleton stood black against the pale October sky, ribs of timber still glowing orange at their tips, the entire winter supply of hay and grain reduced to ash and cinder on the ground. $300 worth of feed, gone before the first hard frost of 1883. Elias stood with his back to her, his broad shoulders rigid under his canvas coat, his hat pushed back on his head in the way she had come to recognize meant he was fighting something internal. His foreman, a wiry man named Gus Hadley, stood off to his right with his hat in his hands and his face the color of old chalk. Two ranch hands hovered near the water trough, useless now, the leather fire buckets still dripping at their feet. Elvira swung down from her mare without waiting to be acknowledged. She walked straight to Elias, and when he turned at the sound of her boots on the hard-packed earth, she saw it, the controlled fury in his jaw, the hollow devastation behind his dark eyes. He was a man who had built everything he owned by his own hand, and someone had just burned it in the night. When, she said, sometime before 4 this morning, his voice came out flat and dangerous. Gus smelled it first. Witnesses, none that'll say so out loud. His eyes stayed on hers. Cord Mercer did this, Elvira. You know it and I know it. She did know it. Cord Mercer had been trying to force Elias off the Hollow Creek Range for 2 years. Ever since Elias had legally registered the water rights that Mercer had assumed were his by virtue of being louder and meaner than everyone else in Caldwell County. The burned barn was a message written in fire. Survive the winter if you can. Come with me, she said. He blinked. What? I said come with me. She had already turned back toward her mare and was reaching into her saddlebag. She pulled out a folded document, 3 of them actually, all bearing different county seals, and held them out to him without ceremony. He took them slowly, the way a man takes something he doesn't yet understand but suspects might change everything. He unfolded the first one, then the second, then the third. The expression on his face moved through confusion, then disbelief, and then something she had not expected to see from a man as self-contained as Elias Hawkins. Pure, unguarded astonishment. These are purchase agreements, he said. Feed contracts, hay from Barber County, grain from Comanche County, and he stopped. Elvira, this one is dated 3 days ago. 4 days ago, she corrected. I signed it in Medicine Lodge on Tuesday. He looked up at her. You did this before the fire. I did this before the fire. The silence between them stretched long enough that Gus Hadley found somewhere else to look. Elias stared at the documents in his hands, and then he stared at the woman standing in front of him, and something shifted in the geography of his face, some old wall coming down that she suspected had been built so long ago he had forgotten it was there. How did you know? He asked. His voice was different now. Quieter, the anger had not left, but something else had entered alongside it. Elvira took a breath. It was not a question she had entirely prepared herself to answer standing in front of a smoldering ruin at 8 in the morning, but she was not a woman who shied from directness. Because I know Cord Mercer, she said, and I know what men like him do when they cannot win by legal means. And because, she paused just briefly, because your operation cannot fail, I would not allow it to. There was a great deal contained in that statement that she had not entirely meant to say. She could see that he had heard all of it. To understand what stood between Elvira Rourke and Elias Hawkins in that moment, the careful distance they maintained, the charged and complicated nature of that distance, it was necessary to go back to the spring of 1882, which was when Elias had first arrived in Caldwell County, Kansas, and when Elvira had first decided she wanted nothing to do with him. She had been managing her father's ranch on her own for 2 years by then. Patrick Rourke had come west from Missouri in 1871, had bought 300 acres of good grass and creek-fed land along the Hollow Creek tributary, and had worked it into a modest but respectable cattle operation before his heart gave out in the winter of 1880. He had left it entirely to Elvira, his only child, because there was no one else and because he had always known, that she was the most capable person on the property regardless of her gender. Her mother had died when Elvira was 11. She had grown up on horseback, learned to read range conditions the way some women learn to read music, and had developed a particular genius for what the old-timers called logistics, the art of knowing what you needed before you needed it, and having it before anyone else even understood the question. She could look at a herd and tell you within a handful of head what the count was. She could read a sky and know 3 days ahead whether to move cattle to higher ground. She could negotiate a contract across a courthouse table with the composure and precision of a Philadelphia lawyer. And she had, more than once, walked away from such a table with terms that made the men on the other side reach for their whiskey glasses in bewildered defeat. She was 26 years old, and she ran the Rourke Ranch with a staff of 4 and a reputation that had spread, in the grudging way that women's competence always spread in those years, through half the county. Elias Hawkins had ridden into Caldwell County in March of 1882 with a string of good horses, a modest amount of capital, and a deed to the 60-acre parcel adjacent to Elvira's eastern fence line. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders and lean in the hips, with dark hair and a set to his jaw that suggested he had made a number of difficult decisions in his life and intended to stand behind all of them. He had come from Texas, from a cattle operation that had not survived a combination of drought, cattle fever, and a business partner whose definition of honesty turned out to be flexible. He said little about any of this. What he said even less about was the fact that the Hollow Creek water rights he had registered, legally, painstakingly, through 6 months of surveying and filing and courthouse paperwork, were the same water rights that Cord Mercer had been informally using as if they were his own for the better part of a decade. Elvira had not been impressed by Elias Hawkins when she first met him. She had been politely indifferent, which in her case was a more careful response than it appeared. She had learned, through observation and experience, that newly arrived men in frontier territory tended to look at a woman operating a ranch independently and see either a novelty or an opportunity. She had been the subject of both assessments, and she found neither of them interesting. What she had not expected was that Elias Hawkins would look at her operation, assess it with his sharp dark eyes, and say nothing at all beyond a brief, genuine acknowledgement that the east fence line was the best maintained he had seen in the county. No qualification, no surprise, just a straightforward observation of quality. She had catalogued that response and filed it away. They had become neighbors in the way that frontier neighbors became neighbors, through practical necessity and shared fence lines, and the occasional crisis that required more than one pair of hands. He had helped her crew when a flash flood took out her creek crossing in July of 1882. She had sent her best hand, a Mexican vaquero named Tomás Vega, to assist when Elias' first small herd arrived, and 3 of the steers needed doctoring after the trail. They had talked across a fence post more times than she could count about water levels and grass conditions, and the increasingly aggressive behavior of Cord Mercer, who owned the largest spread in the county, and had decided that Elias' presence was an intolerable inconvenience. What Elvira had not done, in all of that time, was allow herself to pay attention to the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, or the way her own pulse behaved badly when she heard his horse on the road. She was a practical woman. She did not have the luxury of romantic entanglement, which was what she told herself with great confidence every time she rode home from a conversation with Elias Hawkins feeling unexpectedly, inconveniently alive. The first time he had been genuinely, visibly startled by her was in August of 1882 at the Caldwell County cattle auction. She had brought 40 head to sell, had walked into the auction pen with Tamaz at her side and her ledger under her arm, and had proceeded to conduct herself with a precision that drew the attention of every buyer in the place. When the bidding closed and the final numbers were tallied, she had sold her 40 head at a per-head price that was $14 above the county average for that season. The auctioneer, a weathered man named Phil Hennessy, who had been running cattle auctions since before the war, had leaned across his podium and said, in front of everyone, that he had not seen anyone read the room that well since a cattleman out of Abilene who'd made his fortune by 35. Elias had been at that auction, standing near the back fence with his arms folded and his hat low. She had not looked at him directly, but she had seen the change in his posture when the final numbers were called, that subtle straightening, that slight tilt of the head, and she had tucked that observation away too. The summer deepened into fall, and the situation with Cord Mercer darkened with the season. Mercer was a large man in every sense of the word, physically imposing, financially powerful, and morally unconstrained in the way that characterized a certain kind of frontier success story. He had come to Caldwell County in the early 1870s, had built his operation partly through genuine hard work, and partly through a series of acquisitions that those on the receiving end of them would have described differently than Mercer did. He had a foreman named Dale Witt who was, in the plainest terms, a man who did things for money that other men would not do for any amount. He had 2 hired guns on his payroll whose presence at the ranch was explained as general labor to anyone who asked. When Elias registered the Hollow Creek water rights, Mercer had first tried to contest them legally. That process had taken 3 months and had ended badly for Mercer, largely because Elias had done his paperwork with exceptional care, and because the territorial court had no interest in overturning properly registered rights on behalf of a man whose own documentation was, at best, informal. After the legal avenue closed, Mercer had shifted to a different kind of pressure, the kind applied through reputation, through whispered threats, through the small daily indignities that a powerful man in a frontier community could inflict on a newcomer who had not yet built deep roots. Elias had endured it with a patience that Elvira found both admirable and slightly worrying, the way you find admirable the composure of a man standing near a fire, while also wishing he would step back. By September of 1882, she had begun to understand that Mercer's campaign was escalating. She had her own sources of information. Tamaz had family connections throughout the county, and there were people who talked to Elvira because they trusted her in a way they did not trust men with more overt power. She knew, through those channels, that Mercer had told Dale Witt to find a way to make Elias' operation untenable before the next cattle season. She did not yet know what form that plan would take. She had begun watching the calendar. The first hard frost in Caldwell County typically came in late October. Any rancher who had not secured his winter feed supply by then was in serious trouble, because the feed merchants operated on tight seasonal schedules, and once the regional supply was committed, there was nothing to be had at any price within a reasonable distance. An operation without winter feed faced the unpleasant arithmetic of watching cattle lose condition, selling at distressed prices, or watching them die. This was the arithmetic that Cord Mercer intended to make Elias work through. Elvira had understood that before Mercer's hired man struck the match. The question she had been asking herself, through September and into October, was whether her understanding of Mercer's intentions gave her the right to act on Elias' behalf without his knowledge. It was a genuinely complicated question, and she had not resolved it entirely before she made the first trip to Medicine Lodge. She told herself she was acting on practical necessity. She told herself that a neighbor's catastrophe was, in frontier terms, a community concern. She told herself a number of things, in the quiet of her own house at night, that were true and also did not constitute the complete truth. The complete truth was that somewhere between August and October of 1882, Elvira Rourke had developed feelings for Elias Hawkins that went considerably beyond neighborly concern, and she had absolutely no intention of doing anything about them, and she was going to help him anyway. She had ridden to Medicine Lodge, the county seat of Barber County, on a Tuesday in mid-October, and she had walked into the office of a feed merchant named Alderman Crosby and presented herself as representing a cattle operation in Caldwell County that would require a significant quantity of hay and grain delivered by the first week of November. Crosby had quoted her a price. She had negotiated it down by 8% in 15 minutes without raising her voice. She had signed the contract in her own name because there was no other way to do it, and she had ridden to 2 other merchants in 2 other counties and done the same thing. She had not told Elias she was doing this. She had intended to present it to him as a fait accompli, as a business arrangement that he could reimburse her for at his own convenience, framed in the most practical possible terms. She had not intended to do it while standing in the smoke of his burned barn with her heart doing something complicated in her chest, and his eyes on her face in that specific way that made the practical framing somewhat difficult to maintain. "I'll pay you back every cent," he said. His voice had taken on a quality she had not heard from him before, low and almost rough, as if the words required effort. "I know you will," she said. "That was never the concern." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the contracts and then back at her. "Elvira," he said carefully, "what exactly was the concern?" She held his gaze. "That you would make it through the winter. That Cord Mercer would not win. That's it." His tone was gentle but precise, in the way of a man who had learned to read people and was reading her carefully now. She broke eye contact and looked at the burned barn. "That's enough to work with," she said, and walked back toward her horse. Elias watched her go, and the expression on his face in that moment, had there been anyone close enough to see it, was of a man who had just been handed something valuable and was trying very carefully to understand what it was. The feed wagons began arriving at Elias' property on the 4th of November, 3 days before the first hard frost turned the Kansas prairie iron gray and locked the creeks in their banks. The first wagon came from Barber County, driven by a taciturn man named Webb who looked at the Hawkins operation, looked at the new barn Elias and his crew had spent 2 weeks framing up from timber hauled from the creek bottom, and handed over his delivery manifest with a grunt of professional respect. The second wagon came from Comanche County 2 days later, and the third, a smaller load of supplemental grain, arrived the morning of the frost itself, the driver making jokes about the timing that nobody entirely found funny. Elias stood in his new barn and watched the hay stack up in the loft, and he thought about a woman who had ridden 3 counties over on his behalf before he even knew he needed her to. The thought had been sitting with him for 2 weeks, acquiring complexity and weight with each passing day. It was not a comfortable thought. It was the kind of thought that rearranged things. He had known, in the abstract way that a busy man knows things he is not fully examining, that his feelings about Elvira Rourke were not simple. He had known it since August, since the auction, since he had watched her command a room full of cattlemen and buyers with the quiet authority of someone who had earned that authority through genuine competence and had no interest in anyone's approval of it. He had known it since the first time they had talked across a fence post at dusk, and he had found himself looking for reasons to continue the conversation long past, when the practical content had been exhausted. He had known it, and he had not done anything about it, partly because he was a careful man, and partly because Elvira Rourke did not project availability in any conventional sense. She projected capability and self-possession, and a kind of considered wariness toward men that seemed to him entirely earned and possibly non-negotiable. The feed in his barn changed his calculations. Not because it created an obligation. He would repay her, had every intention of repaying her, and the money was a separate matter entirely. It changed his calculations because it told him something about her that the surface of their acquaintance had not made obvious, and that something was this: that she had decided at some point that he was worth protecting, that she had looked at his situation and at his future and had acted on his behalf at real expense to herself, not because he had asked and not because she had been required to, but because she had chosen to. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything. He rode to her property on the evening of November 6th, after the second feed wagon had left and before the frost came. He found her in the small office she kept off the back of the ranch house, a room that would have surprised anyone who had not been inside it, lined as it was with maps and ledgers, and a careful collection of reference materials on livestock management, range conditions, and territorial law that spoke to the extraordinary depth of preparation she brought to the business of running this ranch. She was sitting at her desk with a lamp at her elbow and a pencil in her hand, working through what appeared to be a feed cost projection. He knocked on the open door. She looked up, and for just a moment, one unguarded fractional second, he saw something in her face that she immediately replaced with composure, but he had seen it. "Elias," she said, not surprised exactly, as if she had been expecting this and had been deciding how to handle it. "I need to talk to you," he said, "and I would prefer you not make it professional while I do." She set her pencil down. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down." He sat. He looked at the room around him, and then he looked at her. "How long have you been watching Mercer?" he asked. "Since he started making noise about your water rights last spring." She was matter of fact. "I know what he's done to other people in this county, the Hargrove family before you came, the Pedersons. He doesn't make frontal attacks, he finds the point of failure and applies pressure there. For you, that was the feed supply. Anyone with a new operation building up stock, reserves tied up in infrastructure, without winter feed, it all collapses." He was quiet for a moment. "You could have told me." She met his eyes. "You're right, I could have. Why didn't you?" The question landed in the room and sat there, requiring an honest answer. Elvira was not accustomed to questions that required an honest answer rather than a practical one. She found that she was not entirely opposed to this one. "Because I wasn't sure how you would receive it," she said finally. "Some men find it," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "difficult when a woman moves ahead of them in practical matters." "Some men," he said, not a dismissal, a distinction. "Some men," she agreed. He leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with the full attention of a man who had decided to stop being careful. "Elvira," he said, "I have been a rancher since I was 19 years old. I have worked with capable people and incompetent people, and I can tell the difference. What you did, the planning, the execution, the timing, that is not something most people in this county could have managed. That is not something most people in this county would have thought to manage." She held very still. "I am not made uncomfortable by a woman's competence," he said. "I am made," he searched for the word, "very much the opposite." The silence in the room was the kind that had weight and warmth to it, the kind that was not empty at all. "Elias," she said carefully, "we are neighbors and we have a professional relationship that is valuable to both of us." "We are," he said, "and I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm just telling you what's true. I respect you more than anyone I have met in this county. I think about you in a way that is not entirely professional. And I believe, from the way you look at me when you don't think I'm paying attention, that the feeling is not entirely one-sided." He paused. "I could be wrong." She looked at him for a very long time. The lamp between them made warm light, and outside the office window, the wind was beginning to carry the first cold edge of the coming frost. "You're not wrong," she said quietly. He let out a slow breath. "Then I'd like to court you properly," he said, "if you'll allow it, no pressure, no obligation, on your terms." It was the last part, "on your terms," that did it. She had been braced for something requiring negotiation. She had not been braced for that. "All right," she said, and then, because she was who she was, "within reason." He smiled then, and it was the first time she had seen him truly smile without reservation, and it was, she thought with some irritation at herself, a devastating thing to witness. The courtship, conducted as promised on Elvira's terms, was one of the more unusual arrangements in Caldwell County's social history, though neither of them particularly cared about that. They had no use for the performative courtship rituals that passed for romance in town, the formal calls and chaperones and careful parlor conversation. What they had instead was this: a genuine, deepening partnership between two people who respected each other's minds, and found that respect transforming, steadily and irresistibly, into something much larger. They met at the fence line most evenings, after the day's work was done, and talked. They talked about cattle and range management and water rights and the territorial politics that governed both. They talked about Mercer, whose rage over the successful feed delivery had apparently intensified rather than diminished. Word had come to Elvira through her channels that he had not taken it well to discover that his strategy had been preempted. They talked about Texas, where Elias had grown up on his father's small ranch, and Missouri, where Elvira had spent her first 11 years before Patrick Rourke decided his daughter needed horizon. They talked about what they wanted, long-term, for their respective operations, and found in those conversations the natural shape of a shared future, though neither of them named it that yet. What Elias discovered, over the course of those fence-post evenings, was that Elvira's competence was not a performance and not a defense mechanism, though it had certainly served as the latter at times. It was simply who she was, the product of genuine intelligence applied consistently over many years to a specific set of challenges, without the social friction that had prevented most women of her era and circumstance from developing that intelligence to its full potential. Her father had not restricted her. The land had not restricted her. She had been allowed to become entirely herself, and what she had become was extraordinary. He found that he wanted to be near her extraordinariness, the way you want to be near a fire in November for warmth, yes, but also for the quality of light it made. She discovered in those same evenings that Elias Hawkins's straightforwardness was not simplicity. He was a man who thought carefully and said what he thought, which in her experience was rare. He had no interest in the social maneuvering and status performance that characterized so many of the men in Caldwell County. He had a dry, understated humor that she appreciated, because it assumed she would understand the joke without having it explained. He listened when she spoke, actually listened, in the way of a man who understood that someone else's knowledge was worth having, and he never, not once, looked at her in the way she had learned to dread, the way that contained in it the reflexive assumption that she would need to be corrected or guided or protected from her own conclusions. He treated her like an equal, not as a courtesy, as a genuine conviction. It was, she thought, unfair. She had organized her life around her independence quite carefully, and here was this man making that independence entirely compatible with wanting him, which disrupted her system considerably. November deepened into December, and the courtship deepened with it. He brought her books from the Caldwell General Store on 2 occasions, a surveying manual and a text on cattle breeding developments out of the Eastern universities, both of which he had clearly chosen because he knew she would find them interesting, not because they were the correct romantic gesture. She found them more romantic than flowers would have been, which told her something about herself she had perhaps known but not quite catalogued. She had him to dinner at the ranch house on the second Sunday of December, a meal she cooked herself. She was a competent cook, though she would have said merely adequate, and over coffee afterward, she spread her maps on the kitchen table and showed him the analysis she had been working on regarding the coming spring cattle market and the most strategic timing for sale relative to expected supply from the Texas trail herds. He followed her reasoning with close attention, asked 2 questions that cut immediately to the assumptions underlying her projections, and then said that her analysis was better than anything the Caldwell County Stock Association had produced in the past 2 years. "The Stock Association has never asked me to present anything to them," she said. "That is a profound waste of talent," he said. She looked at him across the lamp and the maps. "Most people would say it was appropriate." "Most people are wrong," he said simply. She kissed him then, across the kitchen table, with the maps between them and the lamp making warm light on both their faces. It was not a complicated kiss, and it was not chaste, and afterward she sat back in her chair and looked at him, and felt the whole architecture of her carefully constructed solitary life shift on its foundations, not violently, not destructively, but with the deep, inevitable settling of something finally coming to rest in its right place. He looked at her with an expression that contained everything he had not yet put into words, and then he said, very quietly, "I've been wanting to do that since August." "August," she said, "was a long time ago." "It was," he said. "I was being patient." "That was unnecessary, as it turns out." He smiled. "Good to know." The winter proceeded, and Cord Mercer proceeded with it, darkening as the season did. In January of 1883, he made an official complaint to the county sheriff, alleging that Elias had diverted creek water in violation of the existing agreements, a claim that was demonstrably false, and that the sheriff, a man named Burl Fitch who had no particular love for Mercer but less courage, handled by suggesting mediation rather than dismissing it outright. The mediation went nowhere. In February, Dale Witt and 2 other men rode through the south corner of Elias' property and tore down a 1/4 mile of new fence line. Elias and Tomás Vega, who by now spent more time at the Hawkins operation than the Rourke ranch, at Elvira's arrangement, and with her careful logistical management of both properties' labor needs, spent 3 days rebuilding it. In March, a steer was found dead near the water line with no natural explanation, and a week after that, one of Elias' ranch hands quit with visible fear on his face and would not say why. The pressure was constant and calculated and designed to wear at a man's nerves and resources, and it was working, in the sense that it was exhausting. But it was not breaking anything, because Elvira had arranged the winter's survival before Mercer could prevent it, and an operation that had survived the winter with its herd intact and its feed bills paid had the momentum for spring. Through all of this, she and Elias moved steadily toward each other. The courtship had become, by February, something that both of them recognized as more serious than courtship, though the word that belonged to what it was had not been said yet. They were both careful people, in their different ways, and both had things in their histories that had made them careful. Elias' Texas experience with a dishonest partner had left him slow to trust his own judgment about people's intentions, and Elvira's years of operating in a world that consistently underestimated her had left her with a self-sufficient wariness that did not fall away quickly, even for someone she trusted. But it was falling. Steadily, irrevocably, it was falling. The moment that broke the last of it open came on a night in late March, when Mercer's pressure campaign finally crossed a line that could not be overlooked. Elvira had ridden over to the Hawkins property late in the afternoon on ranch business, a question about the spring branding schedule that also required a signed agreement about shared water usage for the season, and she had stayed for dinner, which had become a natural thing by then. After dinner, with the spring evening mild enough to sit on the porch, they had been sitting together in the not-quite-touching way of 2 people who were in the habit of wanting to touch, and not quite doing it freely yet, when Tomás came up from the bunkhouse with the look on his face that meant news. What Tomás had to say was this. Dale Witt had been in town that afternoon, in the saloon on Montgomery Street, and had said in front of multiple witnesses that if Hawkins didn't have the sense to take Mercer's buyout offer by the 1st of April, accidents would start happening to people close to him. The emphasis on people had been deliberate and explicit. Tomás had heard it from his cousin Aurelio, who had been in the saloon and had come to find Tomás immediately because he was not a man who stood by for that kind of threat. Elvira was very still on the porch when Tomás finished speaking. The evening had gone cold, the mild air suddenly carrying something with an edge. Elias was on his feet, The particular quality of the stillness in him, like the stillness before a storm makes good on its promise, was something she had not seen before, and it was both frightening and clarifying. He was a man who did not respond to threat with bluster. He responded with the concentrated, deliberate focus of someone calculating the most effective response, and that was, in its way, more serious than bluster. "Go back to the bunkhouse," he said to Tomas. "Keep everyone in tonight." Tomas nodded and went. Elias turned to Elvira. "You're not riding home tonight," he said, not as a command but as a statement of logistics in the way she herself stated logistical facts. Considered arguing. She decided not to. "No," she agreed. He looked at her in the lamplight from the window. "This is going to require a different kind of response than I've been making," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about that." "Have you?" Not a question. "I've been thinking that Mercer's strength is informal, that his hired men do things that he can't be directly connected to, and that the legal system here isn't strong enough or motivated enough to address that effectively." She paused. "I've also been thinking that the territorial judge, Harlan Moore, owes me a professional courtesy." He stared at her. "What professional courtesy?" "I provided documentation to his court in the Hargrove case in the summer of 1881. Survey records from my property that established the water boundary. Without that documentation, the Hargroves would have lost their claim entirely. Judge Moore knows this. He has told me on 2 occasions that he is in my debt." The look on Elias' face was the particular expression she had come to love, that concentrated attention, that slight widening of the eyes, the moment when he was genuinely, completely surprised by something she had done or known. "You have a territorial judge in your debt," he said slowly. "I have a territorial judge who owes me a professional courtesy," she corrected with precision. "That is not the same thing, and I would not use it casually, but a sworn affidavit about a public death threat filed by multiple witnesses through a formally requested legal channel is not casual. Elvira." He said her name as if it contained something he didn't have other words for. "Don't look at me like that," she said, but without any real sharpness. "Like what?" "Like you're—" She stopped. "Like that," she said inadequately. He crossed the porch in 2 steps and put his hands on either side of her face, and she let him. And the kiss he gave her then was not the careful, tentative thing of kitchen tables and December evenings. It was thorough and honest and made very clear what he thought about her and her territorial judge and her 3 county feed arrangements and her extraordinary, aggravating, magnificent mind. When they separated, she said, somewhat breathlessly, "That's not productive right now." "No," he agreed, not moving back, "but it was necessary. Elias, I'm in love with you," he said simply. "I should have said it in November. I was being patient again." She looked at him, the lamplight. The spring night, the weight of the threat that had just been made and the weight of the thing he had just said, and all the months of careful distance collapsing between them at once. She was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. "I'm in love with you too," she said. "I have been for longer than I intended." He laughed, a short, genuine sound of relief and happiness, and pulled her against him, and she let herself be held with a completeness that she had not allowed anyone to hold her in years, because she had not trusted anyone that completely in years, and this man had earned it. This man who looked at her competence and felt admiration rather than threat, who said on your terms and meant it, who had let her protect him and thanked her for it without shame. They stayed on the porch for a long time, talking quietly about what came next, which was a conversation that now had a different quality. Not just 2 neighbors managing a mutual problem, but 2 people building something. The plan Elvira had been forming crystallized over the next week with her characteristic thoroughness. She wrote a formal letter to Judge Harlan Moore in Wichita, presenting the sworn affidavits of Aurelio and 2 other witnesses to Dale Witt's threat, requesting that a formal inquiry be opened into the pattern of harassment and property damage that Cord Mercer's operation had been conducting against Elias Hawkins. She accompanied this with a meticulous timeline document she had been compiling since October: dates, descriptions, witnesses, property damage assessments, that transformed what could have seemed like a neighborly dispute into something that looked exactly like what it was: a sustained campaign of intimidation and illegal interference. She did not tell Elias she was sending the letter until it was already sent. Old habits. He found out when the judge's response arrived at the Caldwell County courthouse, and Sheriff Burl Fitch, looking extremely uncomfortable, rode out to inform Elias that a formal inquiry had been initiated, and that he was to have no further interactions with Cord Mercer's operation pending the outcome. Elias had looked at the sheriff's uncomfortable face, and then he had looked at Elvira, who was standing beside him because she had been there when Fitch arrived and had not seen any reason to absent herself. "You sent that letter," he said. "I sent that letter," she said, "before you told me." She met his eyes steadily. "I knew you would say we should handle it ourselves." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said, "I would have. And we could have," she said. "But this is faster and cleaner and puts the burden where it belongs, which is on the legal system rather than on the two of us absorbing damage until we decided to escalate." She paused. "I should have told you before I sent it. That was my mistake." He nodded slowly. "Yes, it was." The acknowledgement of that, her saying it plainly and him accepting it without making it larger than it was something important between them. They were learning the architecture of how they worked together, two strong people with their own instincts and their own ways of moving through the world, and that architecture required both of them to adjust, not just her and not just him. "Next time," he said, "tell me first." "Next time," she agreed, "I will." The legal inquiry moved at the pace of territorial justice, which was not fast, but it moved. Judge Moore had taken the affidavits seriously. As Elvira had known he would, Moore was a man who believed in the law's function and who had no particular investment in Mercer's power. In May of 1883, he assigned a territorial marshal named Cole Bancroft to investigate the matter formally. Bancroft was a thorough man, and his investigation uncovered not only the harassment campaign against Elias, but a broader pattern of Mercer's operations that included two disputed land acquisitions from the early 1870s that had legal problems Moore had not previously known about. Cord Mercer hired lawyers from Wichita at considerable expense. The lawyers spent 6 weeks in Caldwell County and produced a significant quantity of paper, and at the end of it all, Mercer reached a settlement rather than face the full exposure of what Bancroft's investigation had turned up. The settlement required him to pay substantial damages to Elias for the burned feed barn and the fence destruction and the harassment campaign. It required him to formally recognize Elias' water rights in writing, and it required him to sell the parcel along his eastern boundary, the parcel that had always functionally blocked direct road access to the Hawkins property, at fair market value to whoever would buy it. Elias bought that parcel. He bought it with the settlement money and some of his own reserves, and the day he registered the deed, he rode to Elvira's property with the document in his hand and the specific expression on his face that she had learned to read as happiness held carefully, not quite believing it was real. "Mercer's lawyers are gone," he said. "He's not coming back." She took the deed from his hand and read it. "Good," she said. Then she looked up at him. "Congratulations, you own your road." "We own our road," he said. She was very still. "That's a complicated pronoun to use about real property." "I know," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a second document smaller, a single folded sheet, and held it out. "I was hoping you'd clarify its application." She unfolded it. It was a letter in his handwriting, carefully composed. It was not a formal legal document. It was something much more personal than that, and it began with her name and said things about her that she had never, in all her careful self-sufficiency, expected anyone to say to her about her mind and her strength, and the specific and irreplaceable way she had changed the shape of his life, not by diminishing him, but by making the world he inhabited larger and more worth inhabiting. At the bottom, after everything else, it asked a question. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket, which was where she kept things she intended to keep. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's it, just yes." She looked at him. "You asked a yes or no question." He laughed, and it was the laugh she had first heard in December on the porch. That sound of genuine, unguarded relief. And then he stepped forward and kissed her in the middle of the ranch yard in the May sunlight, with Tomás Vega watching from the corral gate and making a sound that might have been approval or might have been commentary, and she did not care at all. They were married in July of 1883 at the Caldwell County courthouse, with Judge Moore officiating through a special arrangement because neither of them had strong church affiliations, and Moore, who had a certain admiration for both of them by this point, had been willing. Tomás stood with Elias. Elvira was attended by a woman named Clara Dunning, who ran the town's general store with her husband and who had been Elvira's closest friend in the county since 1881. The ceremony was brief and direct, which was appropriate, and afterward there was a dinner at the Rourke Ranch house, soon to be the Rourke Hawkins Ranch, though the formal renaming took some time. That was, by general consensus of those present, one of the more enjoyable gatherings in Caldwell County's recent history. The question of combining their operations was one they approached with the same practical and intellectually serious attention they brought to everything. They spent 3 evenings in late June, before the wedding, going through their respective ledgers and land maps, and working out a consolidation plan that took the best of both operations and combined them into something larger and more viable than either one alone. Elvira brought her logistics expertise and her supply networks and her 3-county relationships and her extraordinary range-reading ability. Elias brought his livestock expertise and his labor management and his mechanical skills with the increasingly complex ranch equipment of the 1880s and his rock-solid equanimity under pressure. The combined operation was, within 1 season, the most efficiently run ranch in Caldwell County. This was not coincidence. It was the product of 2 exceptionally capable people who happened to have complementary skills and the rare wisdom to recognize and use each other's strengths without competition or ego. That autumn, in September of 1883, while Elvira was going through the accounting for the summer cattle sale, and Elias was in the new barn they had built on the combined property, a proper barn this time, with stone footings, she set down her pencil and sat for a moment with a specific and particular kind of knowledge settling over her. She went to find him. He was working on a harness repair, sitting on a hay bale with the leather and his tools spread around him, and he looked up when she came in with the expression he always had when she appeared unexpectedly, that unreserved welcome, the immediate and full attention. She sat down on the hay bale beside him. "I need to tell you something," she said. He put down the harness. "All right," she told him. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession, none of which she had seen on it before. He was silent for a long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand in both of his, carefully, as if it were something he needed to hold on to. "Elvira," he said, and his voice had broken slightly at the edges. "I know," she said. She squeezed his hands. "I know." He pulled her against him, and she leaned into him in the smell of hay and leather and the particular warmth of him that she had come to understand was as necessary to her now as any of the other things she required, which was a recognition she had arrived at without significant resistance, because fighting it had stopped making sense. Their son was born in the spring of 1884, on the 15th of April, which happened to be the same week the spring cattle market opened in Caldwell County, and which meant that Elvira was monitoring 2 sets of developments simultaneously from the ranch house, with the patience of a woman who understood that timing was not always negotiable. The birth was handled by a midwife named Agnes Porter, a capable woman who had delivered most of the county's children for a decade, and who said afterward that she had never had a patient who asked more intelligent questions during labor, which was a description Elias found both entirely believable and deeply characteristic. They named the boy Patrick Elias Hawkins, for Elvira's father, and for the man who held him that first night with his large hands so careful around something so small, and his face with an expression on it that Elvira stored away in the permanent and most valued part of her memory. Patrick was a serious-faced, watchful baby who became a serious-faced, watchful child, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's jaw, and an evident early interest in the mechanics of how things worked that kept both of his parents engaged and slightly exhausted. By the time he was 2, he had discovered that the ranch ledgers were interesting objects and had made significant contributions to one of them, in crayon, that required Elvira to rewrite 3 pages of feed cost entries. She had done it without real frustration, which surprised her, and filed the crayon-marked original in the back of the ledger book because she was, apparently, that kind of person now. The Mercer situation remained resolved. Cord Mercer, following the settlement, had retreated into a diminished version of his operation with less appetite for conflict, partly because the legal exposure had frightened him, and partly because he was getting older, and the energy required for a sustained campaign of harassment turned out to be, like most things, finite. Dale Witt left the county entirely in the fall of 1883, which was not mourned. Mercer himself sold a significant portion of his land by 1885, in transactions that Elvira tracked with professional attention, and by the time Patrick was walking, Cord Mercer was more or less a historical feature of the county rather than an active concern. Elias had reconciled himself entirely, over time, to Elvira's habit of acting before telling him, not because he had stopped caring, he still preferred to know, but because he had developed a complete and unwavering trust in her judgment that made the sequence of events less important than the outcome, and because she, for her part, had made genuine effort to include him in her planning before execution. They had arrived, as strong-willed people must who choose each other, at an understanding that was the product of real negotiation and real respect, and it worked. The Stock Association, in the spring of 1885, invited Elvira to present her market analysis at their annual meeting. Elias had advocated quietly for this, and then said nothing about it to Elvira, because he had understood that she would prefer to be invited on the merit of her reputation than through his visible sponsorship. The secretary of the association, a man named Whitmore, had made the invitation somewhat grudgingly, as an accommodation to the obvious quality of the Hawkins operation's results. Elvira had accepted the invitation with the even-keeled courtesy of someone who had been waiting for the question to become unavoidable and had prepared thoroughly for it, and she had presented her analysis to a room of 37 men who had, by the end of it, the particular expression of people whose assumptions have been revised. Elias had been in that room. He had watched the faces of the men around him change as she spoke, and he had felt something that was not quite pride. Pride would have implied a possessive relationship to her achievement, but something adjacent and deeply personal. The satisfaction of watching someone you love be completely, irrefutably themselves in front of people who had not understood what they were dealing with. She had caught his eye once, across the room, and the look she gave him was the look of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and knew that he knew it, and it was only theirs. The Stock Association asked her to contribute a monthly report to their bulletin. She agreed, and the bulletin's circulation in the county increased significantly in the following months, which Whitmore recorded in his own notes as a pleasant mystery of membership engagement, and which Elias did not explain to him. In the summer of 1885, they expanded the operation further, bought another 40 acres to the south, added to the cattle herd, and began a small horse breeding program that Elias had been quietly developing for 2 years, and that Elvira had supported with her characteristic thorough research into bloodlines and market conditions. The horses were good, and the reputation of the Hawkins breeding program spread through the territory over the following years in the way that quality always spreads, quietly at first, and then quite broadly. Their second child came in the autumn of 1886. A girl this time, born in November with the first snow of the season falling outside the window of the ranch house. They named her Ruth. She came into the world with her father's dark hair and her mother's manner of looking at everything with bright, assessing eyes, and from the beginning she followed her older brother around the property with a determination that was entirely characteristic of her bloodline. Elias, that November evening, sitting in the ranch house with Ruth in his arms and Patrick asleep in his room, and the snow coming down outside, looked at Elvira, who was sitting up in bed with a cup of tea because she had insisted on tea within the hour of Ruth's arrival, and Agnes Porter had given up arguing and said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "The day you rode up with those feed contracts," he said, "and stood in the smoke and told me you'd arranged it all before the fire, I didn't say the right thing." She looked at him. "What would have been the right thing?" "Thank you," he said simply. "Not just for the feed, for all of it, for knowing, for acting on it. For being who you are and for being willing to be it with me." She was quiet for a moment, with the snow on the window and their daughter in his arms and the particular complete silence of a house that contains everything worth having. "You've said it better than that since," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to keep saying it." She set down her tea and held out her hands, and he came to sit beside her on the bed with Ruth between them, and she leaned her head against his shoulder with the ease of a woman who had learned, entirely against her original intentions, that leaning on the right person was not a diminishment of anything. It was, in fact, the best kind of strength. By 1887, the Hawkins Ranch had become one of the most productive operations in the southeastern Kansas Territory. They ran 300 head of cattle, a horse breeding program with a growing regional reputation, and a winter feed arrangement that Elvira had refined and extended over 4 years into a systematic supply network spanning 5 counties, which she had shared, at Elias' suggestion, and with her characteristic thoroughness, with 6 other small operations in the area as a cooperative purchasing arrangement that reduced costs and eliminated the vulnerability that Mercer had once exploited. This was perhaps the thing she was proudest of, in the professional sense, and Elias understood that about her. Not the personal operation alone, though that was excellent, but the fact that she had taken her own survival strategy and made it a community resource. He had watched her present the cooperative arrangement to the other ranchers, watched them accept it with the slightly dazed gratitude of people being handed something they hadn't known they needed, and he had thought, not for the first or the last time, that the frontier was genuinely different for her presence in it. Tomás Vega, who had been officially on the Hawkins payroll since the consolidation, and was by now the ranch foreman and one of their most trusted friends, had a saying about Elvira that he deployed only in contexts he judged appropriate. "She thinks 6 moves ahead, and she is still here talking to you about the first one." He said this with the affection of someone who had watched it operate for years and whose own fortunes had benefited substantially from it. Tomás had, by 1887, his own piece of land, a small parcel to the west that Elvira had helped him navigate the purchasing process for, because territorial land rights for Mexican vaqueros required careful handling in 1880s Kansas, and she was not a woman who looked the other way at injustice when she had tools to address it. The land was his legally and properly, and the paperwork was, of course, meticulous. Patrick, in the spring of 1887, turned 3 years old and had developed a passionate interest in horses that led him to spend most of his available time at the corral fence, watching the breeding program's animals move. Elias began, carefully, to let him touch them, to let him learn the language of horses from the ground up, and Elvira watched this with a feeling that she had no precise word for, but that was something like gratitude compounded with wonder. She was watching the thing she loved most pass something essential to what came next. Ruth, at 8 months, had an opinion about everything and expressed it with great volume, which Elvira said was a trait that came directly from the Hawkins side of the family. Elias did not argue the point, because arguing it would have demonstrated the point. On a warm evening in June of 1887, they sat on the porch of the ranch house together after the children were in bed, with the Kansas summer sky doing what it did in June, laying on color from horizon to horizon in extravagant farewell to the day, and Elias said, "Are you happy?" She considered the question. She was not a woman who answered things carelessly. "Yes," she said, "completely." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the evening went on in the way of evenings that have everything in them that they need. "I burned 3 counties over to find that feed," she said after a while. "Metaphorically," he laughed. "I know. Mercer was so certain he'd won." She shook her head slightly. "He didn't understand that I had been watching him for 6 months." "You were watching him for 6 months," Elias confirmed. "I was watching him," she said, "and I was watching you." He turned to look at her. "And what did you see?" She met his eyes in the fading light, this man she had chosen with more care and more complete certainty than anything else she had ever done in her professional or personal life. This man who had stood in the smoke of his burned barn and looked at her contracts with astonishment, and then at her with something that had been trying, very hard, to find its right expression for months. "Someone worth the trouble," she said. He pressed a kiss to her temple, slow and sure, the kind of kiss that wasn't going anywhere and didn't need to. "Elvira Hawkins," he said quietly. "Still Rourke Hawkins," she said. "We discussed this." "Rourke Hawkins," he corrected, and she could hear the smile in it. "Better," she said. The summer light failed by degrees across the Kansas prairie, and the cattle settled in the lower pasture, and the horses moved in the corral with their patient, beautiful rhythms, and somewhere inside the house Patrick made a sound in his sleep, and Ruth answered it from her cradle with one of her opinions, and Elias and Elvira sat together on the porch of the life they had built and let the evening close around them like something earned. 3 years later, in the autumn of 1890, the Hawkins operation had grown to encompass 400 head of cattle and 12 horses in their breeding program, with a waiting list for their stock that extended 2 seasons forward. Elvira's cooperative feed network had expanded to include 11 operations and had been written up with her permission in the Kansas Livestock Association Bulletin as a model of frontier resource management. The man who wrote the article had tried, initially, to attribute the design to local ranching interests without naming her, and she had corrected this in the most polite and immovable way possible, and the corrected version named Elvira Rourke Hawkins as the architect of the system. It had occasioned a letter from a woman in Dodge City who was trying to organize something similar, asking for advice, and Elvira had written back at some length, with charts. Elias had read the response before she sent it, and said it was the best piece of practical correspondence he had ever read, which she acknowledged with the particular manner she had when she was pleased, but preferred not to perform it. Their third child, another boy, named for no one famous but for Elias' father's name, James, which was simple and solid and right, arrived in December of 1890, in a hard-driving snowstorm that made Agnes Porter earn every cent of her fee, and that Elias spent pacing the hallway in a way that Tamaz found deeply amusing and Patrick, now 6 and serious, found inexplicable. James was born at midnight loudly into the bright lamplight of the ranch house bedroom, and Elias held him with the same careful wonder he had held each of them, and was incapable, again, of speaking for a full minute. "He's healthy," Agnes said, which was the only word that mattered. Elvira, looking at her husband holding their third child in the lamplight of the house they had built, thought about burned barns and October mornings and 3 county feed contracts signed in a merchant's office in Medicine Lodge on a Tuesday. She thought about standing in the smoke and handing over the documents and watching his face move through astonishment to something much larger. She thought about the letter that was in her apron pocket still, the one with the question at the bottom. She still had it, pressed between the pages of her survey manual, because she kept things she intended to keep. She thought about all of it, and about the children and the horses and the cooperative and Tomas's land and Patrick at the corral fence learning to talk to horses and Ruth's opinions about everything and this December midnight and Elias' face in the lamplight. "Elias," she said. He looked up. "I'm glad I rode those 3 counties," she said. He smiled slowly, and it was still, after all these years, the same devastating thing it had always been. "So am I," he said. "More than I have ever been glad of anything." Agnes Porter, gathering her things by the door, had the sense to find the hallway very interesting for the next several minutes. Outside, the snow came down on the Kansas prairie in the specific, indifferent way of Kansas winters, covering the good grass and the creek banks, and the road that led through 5 counties and back, covering the graves of old difficulties and old fears, covering everything that had been and making the landscape clean and new and ready for what would come next. Inside the ranch house on Hollow Creek, a family arranged itself around a lamp in December, and the fire burned warm, and nothing that needed to last was lost. The morning would come cold and clear, as mornings did in that country, and there would be feeding to do and animals to tend, and a cooperative bulletin to contribute to, and a horse in the breeding program showing excellent form, and 3 children who would wake up hungry and loud, and full of the particular insistent life of children who have been given every reason to believe that the world is worth engaging with at full intensity. There would be all of that, and there would be, as there had been for 7 years and would be for all the years that followed, the 2 of them at the center of it. A woman who thought 6 moves ahead and a man who had the wisdom to stand beside that and call it the greatest fortune of his life. And it was exactly that.